The wind coming off the ridge was sharp enough to sting Luke Rourke's face as he leaned on the corral gate and waited for the familiar thud of hooves. Most mornings, Dust came in easy, the old bay gelding with ears pricked for feed, breath puffing in small white ghosts, eyes soft as creek water. But not today. Today, Dust hovered near the cut-bank, circling and snorting, throwing his head like the cold itself had teeth. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the sky was whitening in that hard winter way that meant the snow would come by evening. The smell of it lived on the air, metallic and clean, the way a rifle barrel smells after it's been oiled. Luke shook the tin grain bucket once, then again. The sound rang small and bright in the brittle morning. Dust didn't move. Luke frowned. The horse wasn't one to act up, not without cause. He latched the gate behind him and started across the pasture, boots crunching through frost-stiff grass, breath fogging in front of him. An old ache pulled at his left side with each step, a souvenir from a different winter, a different life, too far east to name without bringing ghosts along. The world went quiet the way it does when a man starts listening with his skin. No birdsong, no distant shout from a neighbor, just wind and the restless, rhythmic pawing of a nervous horse. Dust's gaze fixed on the ground near the cut-bank, ears pinned forward so hard they pointed, and there Luke saw it. A dark shape where no dark shape should be, a tangle of leather and hair, and the sudden wrongness of skin against frozen grass. He reached her in a handful of long strides and stopped so fast his boot slid. She lay face down, one arm curled under, knees scraped raw as if the land had tried to hold her back. The deerskin dress she wore was torn at the shoulder, the leather laces frayed and hanging loose so the neckline had fallen open and gone dark with blood. Not fresh bright red, the kind that shouts, but a night-old brown, sticky and tacky against the cloth. Her hair, long black burr-studded, veiled her cheek. She clutched a length of strap in one hand like she'd lost a fight with it and refused to let it win. Luke crouched, two fingers finding the side of her throat. A pulse, thin and slow, but stubborn. At the shadow of his hand across her face, her eyes opened for half a second, dark, wide, wild, and then slid shut again. Her breath was shallow and quick, like she'd outrun something and left her lungs behind. There were choices. A man's always got them, though some are fool's gold. He could leave her and ride for town, a half-day there and back if the roads held, longer if they didn't. She'd be dead before he returned. He could try the barn and a pile of blankets. The air was dropping with the sun, and out here the cold wasn't a season. It was a verdict. Or he could do the one thing that made trouble a certainty. He swore under his breath and slid his arms beneath her knees and back. She was light, too light. She smelled of leather, sweat, pine needles and fear. When he lifted her, something in his ribs pulled and burned. He locked the pain behind his teeth the way he always had and stood, steadying her head against his shoulder. Dust fell in behind them, snorting as if to say, "You found her. Now finish what you started." The cabin felt smaller when he shouldered the door open, like four walls, and a room was suddenly too narrow to hold the wild fact of an unconscious stranger. He laid her on the bed, eased the door shut against the wind, and built the fire hot and quick until the stove's skin went the color of a sunset. He boiled water. He washed his hands, slow and thorough, as the small tin kit from the war sat on the table and waited, knowing its turn would come. The bright sting of carbolic opened in the air, memory's little knife. He cut the rest of the torn sleeve away with his pocket-knife, the blade nicking a thread that held and then gave. The wound was a clean slice at the shoulder, knife or nail, or the wrong edge of a bad day, deep enough to need closing. He threaded the needle with a steadiness his insides didn't share. He had sewn men back together in tents that stank of mud and blood and the permanent thunder of the wounded. This was easier and harder all at once. Easier because there were no other screams to cut through. Harder because the silence meant every breath she took belonged, for the moment, to his care alone. He cleaned the blood, stitched with 2 neat passes, tied off with the economy of a man who learned to make do with little. She flinched once, a small sound catching at her throat, but didn't wake. He wrapped the wound with clean cloth and let out a breath he hadn't noticed he was strangling. Alive now, warm now. Those were the first walls you put up against the cold. He covered her with a wool blanket, set a tin cup of water where her hand could find it if she reached waking, then dragged the table chair near and sat. The cabin shifted as fire took the cold out of the corners. The stove ticked in that comforting way iron does when it remembers heat. Outside, dust poured once at the hard earth and went quiet. Luke watched the way her chest rose and fell, slow and stubborn. He watched the fire acknowledge the wood, and the wood surrender to flame. He watched the door as if trouble might grow feet and come walking. He wasn't a man used to company. The house had been a quiet one for 3 years, since the fever came through the valley and Mary's hand had slid out of his. He worked. He slept. He mended. He listened to the wind. There's a kind of peace that isn't joy and isn't grief, but some third thing you accept, because there's no bargaining left in you. He had made a home there, in that third thing. Now here was this girl, the size of a secret, asleep in his bed with a wound he'd claimed long enough to close. He felt the change like a new sound under an old song. By grey light, the fire had burned to a hard-it-all red, and his spine ached from sleeping upright in the chair. He rose, fed the stove until it hummed again, and poured coffee, the bitter steam softening the edge on morning. Only then did she stir. Fingers moving first, a slow curl beneath the blanket, then eyes, opening with the caution of someone who had learned the hard way what waking could demand. He didn't move forward. He knew colts and wounded dogs and men like himself. All of them could hurt themselves on kindness if you brought it too close too fast. "You're safe here," he said, voice low, the vowels turned flat by years of quiet. "You were hurt. I fixed the wound." Her gaze tracked the room, mapping it, stove, shelf, window bright with winter, door. When it landed on him, it held. She said something in a language that moved like river water. Apache, he guessed, though guessing isn't knowing. Then she worked for English and caught it clear enough to matter. "You not soldier?" He shook his head. "Not any more." Her shoulders let go a fraction. He touched his chest. "Luke." He paused. "Rourke." She weighed the words, then touched her chest in mirror. "Nia," she said, and the name fit the shape of her like something rightful. Not much, but a beginning. He nodded toward the tin cup. "Drink." She reached for it with her good hand, fingers trembling more from hunger than fear now that warmth had done its work. She drank until empty and set the cup down with careful ceremony, as if to say that care would be met in kind. Her stomach betrayed her with a loud, honest sound that made the corner of his mouth want to lift. He ladled beans into a tin plate and set it on the table, then stepped back, giving space the value it had. After a moment that measured both of them, she swung her legs over the bed. She was unsteady. There's a way bodies remember harm before minds do, but she didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer it clumsily. Pride is its own salve when the world has stripped you. She crossed the room barefoot, thin ankles darkened with dust, and eased onto the chair. Up close, the story of last days marked her. Dirt on calves, bruises the shape of rough hands at the arms, a tear at the hem stitched badly with haste. He saw it all, and let none of it show on his face. The right kind of seeing is quiet. She ate with the discipline of a person who has been watched while eating. Slow at first, seeking permission in the absence of punishment, then quicker as trust and hunger made their separate cases. When the plate was clean, she set it down and looked at him directly, the question in her eyes larger than the room, the bed, the morning. "You can stay," he said. The words surprised him by how they sounded, ordinary, like he was offering coffee or a chair instead of a reprieve from the road, and yet they laid a track across his chest as if iron were being set down for some train that hadn't yet announced itself. "Till you're strong." She frowned a little at the word stay, as if turning a coin to test the weight. The idea of staying is heavy to anyone who's had to run. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She let the fire talk for her, and the small sounds of the cabin make a soft border around the day. When he went to check on Dust, she stood in the doorway, his spare flannel swamping her narrow shoulders, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the fabric holding the scent of soap and smoke and the old life of a shirt. Her bare legs caught what light the morning had to give. She didn't speak, but her gaze followed him to the corral and back as if she were learning the measure of this place by the man who moved through it. It occurred to Luke that he had not been watched like that, without judgment, but with a wary cataloguing, since long before Mary's laughter had lived under this roof. He felt it and did not look away. He changed the bandage at midday. She sat on the bed because he asked, not because he told. When he unwound the cloth and peeled back the last layer, her mouth thinned at the pull, but she made no sound. The wound was clean. The edges were holding. He said so, and saw something in her loosen by a millimeter, the measure of a day gained. "You live alone?" she asked, when he tied the final knot. "Yes." The word landed flat, but truthfully, and truer still when he followed it with what he owed the question. "Wife died 3 winters back." He kept his eyes on the bandage as he said it. He did not look for pity. He did not find it, even if he had. She nodded, as if the fact explained what she'd already guessed. The quiet, the order, the lack of fuss. "I had family," she said carefully, like the word itself had thorns. "Gone now." He let the space after hold respect. You don't mine another person's loss to make sense of your own. Small work filled the afternoon. He mended a harness strap, the leather warming under his hands. She sorted the shelf where he kept the extra plates, stacking them not by size, but by the small chips on their edges, like a woman who had learned to count her life by flaws, and found comfort in arranging them into something like order. When he hauled water from the creek, she followed, stepping out into the frost with a little wince, then remembered the moccasins by the stove and slid them on with a look that rose to meet his, and said embarrassment was not a language she spoke anymore. At the waterline she stared for a long moment toward the place he'd found her. One hand closed around the same leather strap she'd clutched in the pasture. He asked, not pushing, just naming what needed naming if danger was to be sized properly. "You were tied?" A beat, then a small, hard nod. Camp. Bad men. The words were blunt tools, but they cut all the same. She swallowed. I run. They look. He understood in the practical way a man must when trouble wears boots and rides. You're safe here, he said again, and this time the sentence built a wall inside him as much as it did around her. He felt the weight of it and didn't complain. By evening the wind had shouldered down the ridge so hard the cabin door shivered on its hinges. He'd seen the storm brewing since noon and stacked extra wood inside, checked the latch on the barn twice. Dust was restless, stomping, ears flicking. He set the last buckle on the mended harness, and at the slam of a strong gust she flinched as if the sound had a hand. He set the leather aside. It's just the storm, he said. He didn't say, and the storm is the one thing I can keep out with wood and iron and the ugly persistence of a man who has outlasted worse. Bad men come at night, she said quietly to the door, voice like a string pulled too tight. They won't come here. He meant it. Something in his tone must have told her he did, because she let out air in a measured way, like you teach a skittish foal to do when you lay your hand on its neck. He banked the fire. She stood near the hearth with the blanket around her shoulders, the repaired edge of her dress peeking through the open V of his flannel. When he gestured toward the pallet he'd laid by the stove, she did not move. Cold, she said, the word barely louder than the wind. A pause. Then, with a courage that turned his chest over, close. He froze for the beat a man takes to be sure he has not heard what he wants. The meaning was plain. Not intimacy. Not yet. Just the truth of bodies and winter and the kind of fear that hadn't quite learned it could rest now. All right, he said evenly, as if agreeing to a more piece of wood on the fire. He pulled the blanket back from the bed and sat. She climbed in carefully, on her good side, leaving a small space between them that felt like a country and a bridge at once. He lay on his back, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the weather tear at the roof with teeth it couldn't keep. After a long time her hand found the fabric of his shirt, not seeking, not begging, just resting. He did not move away. The house changed its sound around them, like a river finding a new bank. He woke to grey and the soft awareness of being watched. Her eyes were open, steady on him. She didn't flinch. You stay here, she said. Not a question, closer to a test of the room's ability to hold a statement that might save a life. You can stay, he answered, and somewhere in him a locked door remembered its hinges. Outside, the storm had gifted the world that temporary hush that comes after a night of arguing with the sky. The pasture lay white and beautiful in the hard way winter beauty is, and the corral rails carried a thin crown of ice. Dust nosed the fence for oats, and the day greeted them with chores. They moved through them shoulder to shoulder, checking a rail, setting a bucket, carrying wood. She learned the name of things, rail, latch, kindling, and said each aloud with a concentration that made the words cleaner in his own mouth. When she bent to lift a small armload of wood and a lock of hair slipped over her shoulder, he looked away, because he was a decent man, and because looking away didn't stop the sudden ache that felt nothing like his old wound. The rider came 3 days later, but the opening belongs to the moment before a door is tested, those days when the house relearned warmth and a stranger learned the inventory of a quiet man's mercy. It belongs to the first time she laughed, small and startled, when Dust nudged her for more grain, and she almost scolded him before looking to Luke for permission to be light. It belongs to the sound of thread passing through torn cloth as she mended the hem of her dress by the fire, and the shape of her, in his flannel, sleeves rolled, eyes lowered, mouth set, with the kind of stubbornness that makes a person survive. There are meetings that happen like thunder, all shock and flash, and stories shouted over the ringing in your ears. And there are meetings like this one, a horse's warning, a man's decision, the quiet threading of warmth into a cold place, stitch by stitch. If a life can turn in silence, theirs did, right there, between the stove's red glow and the winter-worn door, with the wind still making its case against the world and the world inside the cabin, learning to answer back. The morning after the storm broke clear and pale, the sky stretching wide as if nothing cruel had ever lived beneath it. Luke rose early, but not earlier than Nia. She was already crouched low by the hearth, coaxing a flame to life with careful hands. His flannel shirt hung too large on her frame, sleeves rolled to elbows, hem brushing against her thighs. Her braid had come loose in the night, black strands falling across her cheek in a way that made her look both worn and impossibly young. She fed a log to the fire as though she had always belonged to that room, as though the small cabin had been waiting for her. Luke stood a moment in the doorway, boots in hand, just watching. He had not woken to the sound of another's quiet movement in years. For a heartbeat, he let himself breathe in the simple, startling normalcy of it, the crackle of wood, the scent of smoke, the slow shifting of her shoulders as she worked. It was nothing, and it was everything. "You sleep?" he asked at last, pulling on his boots. She nodded without looking back. "Warm." Her English was slow, but clearer than yesterday. The word seemed to weigh more than its letters. It meant survival, safety, a reprieve from the endless running that had carved shadows beneath her eyes. The day unfolded with its small rhythms. He poured the last of the coffee and stepped outside into the brittle air. Dust snorted softly in greeting, ears flicking forward as Luke poured grain into the trough. The world was sharp-edged with frost, but inside him something had softened without his permission. When he returned, Nia was waiting by the table, arms crossed lightly, as though she was still uncertain of her place. He gathered clean cloth and knelt beside her, gesturing for her to sit so he could tend the bandage. She obeyed, hesitating only a second before lowering herself onto the bed. When he peeled back the old wrapping, she bit her lip hard, but made no sound. The wound was healing well, the angry red edges clean. He tied the fresh bandage with the same steadiness he had once used on brothers in arms, then leaned back, eyes meeting hers. "You'll heal," he said. She gave a short nod. "You live here alone?" Her voice held no accusation, only quiet curiosity. "Yes," he replied, the knot tightening once beneath his fingers. Then, after a pause, "Wife died 3 winters ago. No children, just me, and the horse." He did not know why the words came so easily, perhaps because for the first time someone seemed to want them. Nia's gaze lingered on his face, as though weighing the truth there. At length she looked down. "I had family," she said softly, testing the word like it might splinter. "Gone now." He didn't press. Some silences deserve respect more than questions. The hours passed with work, the kind of work that stitches a day together. Luke mended a broken harness strap at the table while she sat nearby, quiet but not restless. When he went outside to haul water, she followed, barefoot, until he handed her the moccasins that had dried by the stove. She pulled them on quickly, cheeks coloring faintly, then helped him carry the second bucket back. Inside, she moved through the space with an instinctive grace, sweeping dust from the floor with a bundle of twigs, stacking tin plates neatly on the shelf. It wasn't servitude. It was something else. A claiming, a making place. Luke watched her from the corner of his eye, careful not to break the spell. The cabin had not felt tended since Mary, and the small acts of order made it different now. Not crowded, not foreign, just alive in a way he had nearly forgotten. At midday, he caught her gaze shift toward the creek, toward the place he had found her. Her hand closed involuntarily around the leather strap she still carried. He asked the question because it had to be asked, his voice low but steady. "You were tied?" Her body stilled. Then she nodded once, curt and sharp. "Camp, bad men. I run. They look." The effort of the words carved lines into her face. Luke's jaw tightened, but his reply was quiet. "You're safe here." And this time, it was not just reassurance. It was a vow. That night, the storm rose again, sleet hammering the roof. Nia flinched at each slam against the shutters, eyes darting toward the door as though expecting it to splinter. Luke set aside the harness he had been repairing and said gently, "It's just the storm. Nothing more." His tone, calm and iron-strong, steadied her breath. When he banked the fire, she did not move to the pallet by the hearth. She stood wrapped in a blanket, eyes on him. "Cold," she murmured. Then, after a long pause, "Close." The meaning struck through him, sudden and undeniable. Not a request born of desire. Not yet. Simply need, the raw human need for warmth and nearness. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right." They lay side by side, a narrow stretch of space between them. The storm clawed at the cabin, but inside it was another world. At length her hand brushed his shirt and stilled there, not asking, not pleading, just resting. He didn't move away. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out. Light slipped grey through the window, painting her face in muted silver. She was already awake, eyes steady on him. "You stay here," she said, voice quiet but sure, as though she needed to anchor herself to the truth of it. "You can stay," he answered, and the room itself seemed to take a new shape around the words. From then on, their days twined together. She followed him to the fence line, holding nails while he reset a rail. Her fingers brushed his when she passed the hammer back, and neither of them pulled away. She swept snow from the porch, carried small armfuls of kindling to the stove, placed bread beside his hand when he forgot to eat. He taught her words, snow, sky, home, and she repeated them with care until they sounded right in her mouth. Each attempt, each small smile when she got close, built something that neither dared to name. At night, she no longer asked where to sleep. She went to the bed as though it belonged to them both, leaving space but never distance. Her hand would find his chest in the dark, tracing the line of an old scar, and her breathing would fall into rhythm with his. It was in these quiet moments, her laughter when dust nudged her for more grain, her hair falling loose as she bent to lift a log, the sound of her voice testing the word home, that Luke realized the cabin was no longer a tomb. It was becoming something else entirely. And though he knew the men who had marked her might yet come riding up the trail, he also knew one thing with a certainty that burned steadier than the stove fire. Whatever came, they would face it together. The frost clung longer to the rails now, glittering pale under the weak winter sun. Each morning Luke rose with the familiar creak of the stove cooling beside him, but he did not rise alone. Nia was there, sometimes already awake, sometimes sleeping with her braid undone across his arm, sometimes watching him with those dark, unblinking eyes that seemed always to measure whether she was still safe. And each morning the answer was yes. Their days grew into a rhythm, not planned, not spoken, but natural as breath. Luke carried the heavy buckets from the creek, and Nia followed with smaller ones, careful not to spill. He split wood, his shoulders moving with the sure rhythm of long habit, while she gathered the pieces light enough for her arms. She moved quieter than most women he had known, but not like a shadow anymore. She claimed space without apology, setting bread on the table, sweeping dirt into the corner, tucking dried herbs from her small pouch into the simmering beans so that the cabin began to smell less like a tomb and more like life. Sometimes Luke caught himself watching her the way a man watches a horizon for change. The tilt of her head when she listened for the horse. The way her lips moved as she tried new English words he gave her. Rail, sky, kindling. She repeated them until they softened, then smiled in that fleeting, unguarded way that could undo him if he let it. He did not let it, not fully. The shadows of her past still lingered, trailing her like wolves that had lost the scent but not the hunger. At night she sometimes woke with a start, eyes wide, breathing fast. Once she whispered, "Men look for me still." Luke did not lie. "Maybe," he said, steady as stone, "but not here." She pressed closer after that, hand resting against his chest, and her breath evened as if his heartbeat could anchor her. They grew closer, not in sudden bursts, but in small seams stitched tight. When Luke worked at mending a cracked stirrup, she came and sat cross-legged by the fire, watching, then asked to hold it. Her fingers brushed his when he gave it back, and neither of them moved away. When she cooked, she pressed bread into his hand with a look that said she saw his habit of skipping meals, and he ate because she asked without words. One evening she laughed, full and sudden, when dust nudged her for more grain and nearly toppled her into the snow. The sound startled Luke more than any rifle shot. He hadn't heard laughter inside those walls since Mary, and this laughter was different, fragile, unpracticed, but real. Something in his chest loosened with it, and yet, beneath it all, shadows stirred. Once, while he was repairing the corral, Dust snorted a warning, ears pinned back toward the ridge. Luke straightened, hand brushing the rifle at his side, and saw nothing but distance. Still, the air carried a weight. Nia froze at the sound, clutching the strap she still sometimes kept near, and whispered, "They come." Luke put a hand on her shoulder, steady, grounding. "If they do, they won't take you." His tone was so final, it silenced the fear, though in his own heart he knew the ridge could carry more than wind. Their closeness deepened slowly, like snow layering day after day until the ground itself changed shape. Luke found himself watching the line of her back when she bent to lift a log, the curve of her cheek in firelight, the way her fingers lingered when she handed him a tool. He chastised himself for it, tried to bury it under work, but the noticing would not be unlearned. One night, as the storm clawed the shutters, she asked him quietly, "You afraid of me?" The question cut deep, sudden and unexpected. He looked at her long, then said, "Not any more." Something eased in her shoulders at that, and for the first time she reached across the space between them, her hand brushing the back of his. He didn't pull away. The kiss, when it came, was not fire striking flint, but embers coaxed alive. She leaned in with a certainty that left no room for doubt, and Luke's hands found her waist as though they had been waiting there. Slow, sure, warm. When she pulled back, her breath steady, she said softly, "I stay." Not as a question this time, but as a truth already written. From that night on, the air in the cabin shifted. It was no longer about survival alone. Their movements grew in tandem, wordless understanding flowing like water between them. She helped him carry wood without needing to be asked. He set tools within her reach before she even turned to look for them. She smiled more, though still rarely, and each smile was a small, unguarded gift. But the shadows had not vanished. Some evenings, when Luke sat cleaning his rifle, she would pause in her mending and watch him, her gaze following the barrel as if it carried both fear and comfort. She knew, as he knew, that the world outside their fragile peace had not forgotten her. The men who had tied her, who had left her broken in the snow, would not give up easily. Luke saw it in the way she sometimes paused at the window, in the way her eyes darted at the distant snap of a branch. He said nothing of it most times. But one night, when the fire had burned low and the silence between them was softer than words, he touched her hand lightly and said, "Whatever comes, we face it together." She met his gaze, and for once there was no fear in it, only a fierce kind of trust that felt heavier than any vow. The days went on, each one adding another thread to the fabric they were weaving. The land was still cold, the world still dangerous, but inside the cabin something fragile and strong was taking root. Not passion alone, not yet, but the steady burn of two lives learning the shape of one another, shadows and all. And though Luke knew the ridge might one day deliver riders and rifles, he also knew this: when that day came, they would not meet it apart. The first sign of danger did not arrive with noise, but with silence. Dust, who rarely gave warning without reason, stood stiff by the corral, ears pinned flat, his breath puffing in steady bursts that smoked in the frigid air. Luke was splitting wood near the barn, the axe biting deep, when he heard that snort, the low, uneasy one that belonged to predators and men, not deer. He straightened slowly, fingers brushing the haft of the weapon as his eyes swept the ridge. Snow muted the world, each sound caught and softened, but in that hush he heard it, the crunch of hooves where no neighbor should ride. Luke set the axe down, calm as ritual, and wiped his hands on his coat. Nia stepped onto the porch, braid dark against the pale of her repaired dress, eyes narrowing at the sound. He turned sharply toward her. "Inside," he said, voice even, but she shook her head once. "I stay." The words held no fear, only steel. For a long beat he considered pressing her, but something in the way her chin lifted told him she was finished running. Two riders crested the rise, snow breaking beneath their horses. Luke recognized one, The man who had come before, voice too casual, eyes too sharp. Beside him rode another, larger, a scar running down his jaw like a brand. They did not dismount. The first called out, "Afternoon, Rourke!" Luke stepped forward into the yard, boots crunching, the rifle already within reach, though he had not raised it. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "Looking for someone, young Apache woman, about yay high." He gestured with gloved fingers. "Ran from camp a while back. Scar on the shoulder. Dress torn. Sound familiar?" Luke's jaw clenched, but he didn't glance toward the cabin. "Lot of ground out here," he said flatly. The second man leaned in his saddle, eyes sliding past Luke toward the porch where Naya still stood, back straight. "Pretty thing," he muttered. The words carried a weight that struck hot in Luke's chest. He shifted forward one step, boots planted deep in the snow. "You set foot in my yard," he said, tone low but hard as iron, "and you'll regret it." The scarred man's grin faltered. The first spat into the snow, tugged at his reins. "You'll find yourself on the wrong side of this, Rourke. She's worth good money." Luke closed the distance another pace, the rifle steady across his hands. "She's not worth a damn thing to you. Ride." For a long moment, the yard held nothing but the sound of horses shifting. Then, with curses under their breath, the riders turned, snow crunching beneath hooves as they disappeared back down the trail. Luke stood unmoving until the ridge swallowed them whole. Only then did he turn back. Nia hadn't moved. Her eyes were on him, wide but steady. "They come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Luke admitted. She stepped down from the porch until she stood in front of him. Her hand trembled, but her voice did not. "Then I fight." She tapped her chest once, a soldier's oath in a woman's body. Luke studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out the small knife he kept. He placed it in her hand, hilt first. "Then you fight." Something passed between them then, final, fierce. She closed her fingers around the knife, and for the first time her touch did not carry fear. That night, when the fire burned low, she came to him not out of cold or necessity, but choice. Her kiss was sure, not tentative, and he answered it without hesitation. They undressed slowly, carefully, as if each scar, each mark, each wound needed acknowledgement. When her hand rested on his chest, tracing the old lines carved there, he did not flinch. And when she whispered, "You mine now?" he answered without pause, "Yeah, yours." The cabin, which had once felt like a tomb, now pulsed with life. But outside, the world had not forgotten them. At first light, 3 days later, dust gave another warning snort. Luke was already dressed, rifle in hand, when the sound of hooves carried through the brittle air. 2 figures rode into the yard, the same men, this time slower, eyes narrowed. One carried a shotgun across his lap. The first man called, "Step aside, Rourke. You don't want this fight." Luke leveled his rifle, voice calm. "You're not taking her." The yard went still, breath steaming from horses, the air brittle with threat. The scarred man spat and began to swing down from his saddle, but dust poured hard at the ground, ears flat, snorting with fury. The sudden movement checked him. Luke didn't lower the rifle. "Mount up and ride," he said evenly. "You come back again, You won't ride away." For a tense second, it seemed they might test him. But the weight in his stance, the steadiness of the barrel, the silent presence of the woman watching from the porch, all of it pressed down like judgment. At last, the first man yanked his reins, muttering, "Not worth the trouble." They turned and rode off, the ridge swallowing them once more. Inside, the cabin breathed differently. Lighter. Nia set the knife on the table, stepped across the small room, and pressed her hands against his chest. This kiss carried no fear, no hesitation, only certainty. From that day, the shadows did not vanish, but they changed. They no longer belonged to her alone. They belonged to both of them, shared and shouldered, and whatever the ridge carried in the future, they would face it together. The cabin was no longer just shelter. It was a home. And for the first time since grief had carved Luke hollow, tomorrow did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to claim. Winter deepened until the land itself seemed carved from ice. Days began with the breaking of frost at the water trough and ended with the cabin glowing like a lantern in the endless white. But within those walls, life no longer felt borrowed. Luke and Nia moved through their days as though they had been written into each other long before the snow came, their silence no longer heavy but full, like a river carrying meaning beneath still water. She no longer flinched at every creak of the shutters. She walked the yard with steady steps, her moccasins crunching snow, dust following close, as if he too had claimed her. The scar on her shoulder had faded from raw red to something that belonged to healing, and when Luke changed the bandage one last time, she whispered, "No more running." He met her eyes, saw the fierce certainty there, and nodded once. No more. Together they built small rituals that became the bones of a new life. She cooked beans with dried chilies, and he pretended not to notice when she pressed the largest portion into his bowl. He taught her words, roof, nail, sky, and she taught him others in her tongue, sounds shaped from rivers and wind. Some evenings they sat by the fire trading names for the same thing, laughing at the way each tongue stumbled over the other. He realized one night that he had not heard laughter in his own voice for years, and yet, though peace had rooted itself, the memory of riders still lingered on the ridge. Luke sharpened his knife, oiled the rifle, not out of fear, but out of duty. Nia, too, carried herself differently now. The knife he had given her rested always at her hip, not as burden, but as choice. "If they come," she told him one night, voice steady, "I fight beside you." He had not argued. Some vows are made with steel, others with love, and hers was both. When the riders failed to return, day after day, the fear drained like meltwater. In its place grew something neither had dared name before: permanence. Luke watched Nia as she stood one dawn by the corral, her hair braided against the wind, dust nosing for oats between them. She turned, caught him looking, and instead of glancing away, she smiled, slow, certain. In that moment he knew this was not survival anymore. This was home. That evening, after chores were done and the fire hummed low, Luke pulled a small horseshoe nail from the box near the stove. With pliers he bent it, worked it, smoothed it until it caught the light like a ring. He placed it on the table between them. "You don't have to wear it," he said, voice quiet but firm. Nia picked it up, turned it in her fingers, then slid it onto her hand. "I wear," she said simply. Her eyes held his, and something in his chest eased that had been locked for years. The cabin changed after that, not with grand gestures, but in the way 2 cups stood ready on the table, in the way her sewing gathered at the hearth, in the way his rifle leaned by the door. But his eyes found hers first. Nights were no longer marked by storms clawing at the shutters, but by the warmth of her forehead pressed against his jaw, her breath steady in the dark. Spring would come eventually. The snow would recede, the creek would swell, and the valley would green again. But Luke no longer marked time by seasons. He marked it by the sound of Nia's laughter, the strength in her shoulders, the trust in her gaze. For the first time since Mary's death, tomorrow was not a burden, tomorrow was theirs. And so the man who had once lived alone with his grief now lived with a woman who had outrun shadows and chosen to stay. Their story was not one of rescue alone, nor of escape, but of 2 souls finding in each other the rarest kind of shelter. A home built not of wood and stone, but of trust, of firelight, of hands meeting in the dark. Because sometimes love does not arrive with thunder or glory. Sometimes it arrives on a horse's warning, in a wounded girl's breath, in the quiet choice to stay when running has been the only language you knew. And when it does, it remakes everything. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that love can grow even in the coldest winters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, do you believe that love found in the harshest trials can last a lifetime? Your voice matters here, and we'd love to hear it.